Okay, hello everyone, welcome back, or welcome. Hope you had a nice lunch. So we're going to continue with our second panel, which is called Ovoo Histories. And
I'm sorry, I don't know in which file you put your
so you're just going to
okay. Thank you very much. Here, it's okay.
Our event is all about the structures called Ovoo, and we're thankful to the Friends Berkeley Fund, as well as the Institute of East Asian Studies, the Mongolia Initiative, the Towns of the Humanities for contributing to this great project. Okay, so I think we're ready to start again. Our first speaker on this panel is Isabelle Charlot, who is professor at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. And she's going to be the first presenter. This panel has a couple of really interesting presentations about mapping practices, Qing mapping practices. So without further ado, I think I'll just...
Thanks.
Oh, she's also one of the organizers of the event.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll speak on the maps of the banners of Inner and Outer Mongolia, but the real specialist of maps here is Anne-Sophie, who will speak just after me. Thank you, Anne-Sophie. So these maps, those I'm studying are late 19th century, early 20th century, were drawn to be sent to the central administration of the Qing Empire, that is the Li Fan Yuan, the board of government of the outer regions. And these maps have a great number of names and drawings, and especially of Ovoos. About a quarter of the toponyms have Ovoo in their name. So what do this map tell us about Ovoos? The map distinguishes between two types of Ovoos: the cult Ovoo, that serve as altars for community rituals to the territorial deities, and boundary marking Ovoos, which delimitate boundaries with the neighboring banners or neighboring countries. In addition, many mountains are also called Ovoo. So my paper raises questions about their representation, where their location on maps precise enough to delimitate boundaries between banners, where boundary marking Ovoos simple border devices used by the Qing government, or could they also have a religious function? And also another question is, are there less or no cult Ovoos in the banners of Inner Mongolia, where agriculture was intensively practiced? I based my study on the maps preserved in Berlin. They are dated late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and were collected by Walter Heissig and Hermann Constant. By imperial decree, every Mongol prince had to submit a map of the banner he ruled, accompanied by a written report that precisely indicated the boundaries of the banners. The Qing government were at that time obsessed by the boundaries of the banners. So these maps are political documents produced for the centralized government, and they thus could allow the symbolical possession of a territory or even a military control and exploitation of the territory. They were not public and they have not been printed. Well, they were not public. Apparently, Anne-Sophie has some information on the black market of maps. So these dates, this period is a period of great transformation. As you know, economic crisis, when the Mongol lands were no longer considered as a buffer region between the Qing and Russian empires, but as an area to develop and to exploit. So the Qing authorities requested information on agriculture, forestry, minerals, fishing, boundary posts, relay stations, trade, and minerals that they thought to exploit. And in Inner Mongolia at that time, the territory was transformed by Chinese immigration and formation of villages, increased exploitation of natural resources, and a lot of ethnic tensions between the Han and the Mongols. Although made on Qing order and supposed to follow conventions, these banner maps can be considered as emic documents and reflect a Mongol worldview, and as you will see, they are very diverse. They were produced in the administrative center of the banner, the yamen, and were copied so that the banner preserved a double of the map. And then they went sent to Beijing, where they were translated into Chinese. They had to follow specific rules, and they were supposed to give indication on the boundaries by oboes, the use of measurement units and of a grid of longitudinal and latitudinal lines. These rules were not always respected. They show different degrees of abstraction and many regional differences, and most of them mix abstract conventions and pictographic elements. These are 11 families of maps I could identify. In outer Mongolia, the maps pay particular attention to their boundaries, and Anne-Sophie will focus on maps of the Setsenhai and Mike in eastern outer Mongolia. So often there's almost nothing in the interior of the maps, only a few landscape features. But on the top right, you see maps from inner Mongolia, which are much more pictographic, even sometimes landscape paintings with their overabundance of details. Most of the scholars who worked on these maps were interested in toponyms. About a quarter of these toponyms, as I said, designate ovoos. They can be named only in Mongolian or in Chinese or both, or named and depicted or depicted only. The great majority of them are depicted on mountain and hill summits, tops. For cult ovoos located on mountain tops, in most cases the attached name is the name of the mountain. So many mountains are called Ovoo, probably sacred mountains. One of the most worshipped mountains of present-day Mongolia, as you know, is the Altan Ovoo of the Dariganga. So Ovoo can be synonymous for sacred mountains. Other ovoos, I will show a lot of slides. So other ovoos are named ovoos or mountain passes, or rivers, lake, springs, wells, etc. They were usually made of stone, but there were also a lot of wooden ovoos that sometimes are depicted differently from stone ovoos as kind of vertical tufts or branch-like shape, triangular shape. So the main reason for the central government to commission these maps was to document the boundaries with neighboring banners. You know that the herders in the Tang period was forbidden to trespass their boundaries and incurred severe penalties if they were caught. And as will show Anne-Sophie, after the regulation of 1864, the boundary ovoos were built more systematically, which impacted probably land use and migrations. And the poor banner officials had to check regularly, annually, that the ovoos were in place and rebuild them. They also had to check that the location of the ovoos corresponded to the location on the banner map. The banner maps were occasionally made to solve conflicts on boundaries. They are therefore the result of a process of negotiation between the central authority, the reigning local princes, Jazak, and the chief of the league. The ovoos also mark the boundaries of the pastures of the relay stations inside banners, as well as imperial hunting grounds and reserved areas. And there were also a lot of boundary outposts, harul, that delimited buffer zones to guard the border with Russia. The boundary ovoos apparently didn't have a religious function. They were apparently not consecrated. Yet the monks from the main monastery of the banner used to make the circumambulations of the boundary of the banner with the kanjur, the sacred scriptures, in order to protect and bless its inhabitant, especially in cases of epidemics. So the boundary ovoos closed the territory and protected it also against evil influences. It is possible that some ovoos that nowadays are located on mountain passes at the entrance of a valley or on roads were former boundary ovoos. The ovoo of passes therefore mark places at the edge of different geographic and symbolic worlds. So for me it's very logical that the Qing government chose this symbol, this material symbol, to delimitate the banner's boundaries. The ovoos are often have long descriptive names explaining their location on a mountain, their exact location. And in addition, precise indications are written near the boundary lines, giving the names of the adjacent banners and the distances between oboes. Boundaries, of course, were also materialized by mountain ranges, lakes, rivers, by the Great Wall in Inner Mongolia or the Palisades, and also by lines, black dotted line or a continuous red or black line connecting the different boundary oboes. The most remarkable maps with boundary oboes are that of the banners of Tushet Khan and Setsen Khan in Outer Mongolia. And in Setsen Khan Aimak, all the boundaries oboes are numbered from 1 to sometimes to 100 or more. Some maps have more than 100 oboe. And they are numbered starting from the bottom or from the left in the clockwise direction. On the maps of the Tushet Khan Aimak, they are not numbered, but the banner may be surrounded by a circle indicating the 24 or 48 directions. And as you can see on other maps, there's no circle, but the texts are radiating from the center as if there was one. So you have to turn the map to read all the inscriptions. These oboes, boundary oboes, are depicted as small symbols on the boundary line, small dashes, black or red dots, or triangle. Sometimes, as you can see, it's more pictographic with triangle symbolizing a mountain or a small mound. On the maps of Western Outer Mongolia, they are only marked on the boundaries with other Aimaks, and they are symbolized by two rectangles. As you can see here, two elongated rectangles of different sizes. On these maps are also at the border with Russia are also depicted border posts as crosses or with the same two rectangle symbol of oboe. So these border posts delimitate buffer zones with Russia and also with Tang, Qinghai. Here it's a map in Inner Mongolia of the Uzumchin left banner. The oboes, there's here it's written Harul, border post, and on the other it's written oboe. And they delimit, so the main difference is that at border post there was a family, people guarding the border, the boundary, and it delimitates inside the banner an imperial hunting ground. The banners were also crossed by roads with relay stations, notably on the main caravan road from linking Hovd to Qinghai and Urga. They are marked as a dotted line with triangles. And you also have boundary oboes marked with this kind of red symbol, red dot or flames crowning mountains. And here they are depicted as kind of big boulders on mountain summits, or on the right by more realistic drawings, like a flag on the mountain. So these are boundary oboes. These boundary oboes are usually well differentiated from cult oboes on maps of Western and Outer Mongolia. But it's not the case in the maps of Inner Mongol banners. The boundary oboes are depicted exactly the same as the cult oboe. So it's not always obvious when it's on a border or a boundary if they are boundary oboes or cult oboes or both. Here is the map of Edingol. Inner Mongol banners use the same drawing for boundary oboes and cult oboes, but here you see an old photos taken in the 1930s by Van Hecken. In the background you see a boundary oboe, which apparently, but I'm not sure, has no pole or flag above it. It's just a very high mound, earth mound. The agricultural lands in Inner Mongolia are not delimited by oboes, but by dotted lines. For instance, this is a map of the Wang banner in Ordos. That delimitates areas for Chinese cultivations. Now about ritual oboes. So this category, of course, is well known of specialists of Inner Asia. They usually are erected on the summits or highest slopes of the mountains, but also to mark near rivers, springs, oddly shaped trees, etc. And every banner also had a main Ovoo, a banner of what we call a banner Ovoo, and the prince of the banner and the lamas of the main monastery of the banner used to make a ritual to the banner Ovoo, usually on the highest peak of the banner. And the monasteries also had usually had the Ovoo behind their main, actually on the hill behind them. The great majority of maps of the Tushetran and Setsenran Aimak indicate what is probably the height of mountains in Gadzar and Khouv after the mountain name, but Anne-Sophie just suggested it could be also not the height, but the perimeter of the mountain, because some figures are absurd. And here in the middle of the map is the great mountain Khenti Khan, the region where, Genghis Khan was buried, and it's the highest mountain of the banner. The maps of Inner Mongolia depict some outstanding mountains with particular shapes. Sometimes they are topped by an Ovoo and they are higher than the others, so we can assume that it's the most sacred mountains of the banner. They are often called Bogd Ul or Khailkhan. Some mountains are called Shire, the throne or altar, or they're called Dosh Ul, Anvil mountain. These are particularly worshipped because they represent the perfect altar. The cult Ovoos are represented either by symbols, or such as red dots, round marks, triangles, or by naturalistic drawings, as you can see here, or just by small dots or dashes crowning mountains. On these maps you can see boundary Ovoos, which are slightly different from cult Ovoos. There's very big cult Ovoos just here on the border, so this may be a cult worship mountain, and these are numbered boundary Ovoos, numbered from 1 to 3, etc. So there were some mountains located on the edge of territories. And this that may also have been used as boundary Ovoos. So the two symbols, the two Ovoos may conflate in the same mountain. So this reminds me of the article in which Caroline Humphrey describes this edge-based centricity about central mountain marking the boundary and at the same time linking different communities. Here is another example of a big mountain serving as a landmark, a major landmark and boundary landmarks. Very quickly, some examples of Ovoos located behind, on the north part of the encampment or residence of the banner prince, the Jazak. So you see that behind the residence is the mountain topped by an Ovoo, and many maps have one prominent mountain, often at the center of the mountain, topped with an Ovoo. So it may be the banner's sacred mountains with the banner Ovoo. Here you see on the right Mount Bogdhan, which is the main Bogd Ul, the main worship mountain south of Ulaanbaatar. South of the Jazak's residence here is one big mountain crowned by a piled rock Ovoo. So I show you many instances of a very prominent mountain with a big Ovoo, often located at the center of the map, designated the highest, probably the banner Ovoo, the highest mountains. And here again in Ushin in Ordos, just located north of the encampment of the Jazak. Here again, you see the very naturalistic drawing of Ovoos. Here, a high prominent mountain among the Torgut of Etzingol. And here again, so these maps are sometimes very beautiful paintings too. Here are examples of Ovoos located and protecting monasteries. And you see that the monastery is sometimes depicted from a top view or a front view. Here other examples of Ovoos located on a mountain behind monasteries. And here you see old photos of Ovoos behind famous monasteries compared to the map. This is in Inner Mongolia. And on some maps, all the mountains are topped by an Ovoo. Sometimes you have only one cult Ovoo in the center of the map, and sometimes all the mountains are crowned by an Ovoo, or all the highest mountains are marked by an Ovoo, or a tuft, or yellow dot, or something that evokes an Ovoo. These cult Ovoos located inside the banners are especially numerous in eastern Inner Mongolia and Schilingol League. And these maps superimpose, with a very high number of monasteries and a high number of Ovoos, superimpose the two sacred geographies. And sometimes the number and size of Ovoos and of monasteries are comparable. And it's up to 10 or 20 Ovoos and 20 monasteries on the same maps. I tried to compare with modern maps, and it appears that the great majority of place names have changed, especially in Inner Mongolia, as well as many landmarks. The courses of rivers have been diverted, notably because of irrigation in Inner Mongolia. The lakes and rivers have dried, and even some mountain summits have sometimes been leveled by mineral exploitation. So you can't even recognize the mountain of a banner. And on these maps, I could recognize the two lakes and the rivers, but I couldn't identify this very high Bayanjuk mountain and other place names. And it may be an example of a minor elevation depicted as a very high peak. But we have local gazetteers that sometimes precisely locate the old monasteries. Even when they were destroyed, we know their location. So for some banners, the monasteries appear to be the most reliable landmarks, because the name of mountains have changed. So I can only rely on monasteries to compare the two maps. And here I compared the monasteries of a map of Al-Khorchin, and from when locating the monasteries, then I could locate the main Ovoos, the main peaks of the banner. I've almost finished. This is the revived Ovoos in Inner Mongolia, in the same banner I showed before in the Al-Khorchin banner. Probably the banner Ovoo, which was rebuilt, etc. Now the Ovoos in Inner Mongolia belong to the official cultural heritage. And the same for a very beautiful map of Reshikten banner in Inner Mongolia, where you see several Ovoos on high peaks, and here I could compare, again based on the lake and some features and the monasteries, and locate the different Ovoos that were depicted on the banner map. In conclusion, the banner maps show different visual cultures, and the number and types of Ovoos per banner vary a lot. As we have seen, the Lithuanian demanded that boundary Ovoos were positioned of maps, but the Lithuanian didn't have a special requirement about cult Ovoos. So the Mongols themselves, they choose to represent or not the cult Ovoos on their maps. So why depict these cult Ovoos on banner maps if the information was not asked? And why name them on the map in spite of the fact that the mountain names, the sacred mountain names in Mongolia are taboo? That's why many mountains are called Jazbogd or Haikhan. I don't have the answer. And finally, I insist that the name Ovoo is often synonymous with the name sacred mountains. And just to end with, the main Ovoos were and are still used as landmarks, as visible markers from afar, very useful for orientation, especially in the flat steppe. So the fact that the majority of banner maps depict and name cult Ovoos, in my eyes, show that they are emic representations of the landscapes. And probably I think that in many cases the map makers took some pleasure in making the maps of their banners. So as we have seen, the two categories of boundary Ovoos and cult Ovoos were sometimes blurred, and cult Ovoos were sometimes used as boundary Ovoos because they are located on the boundary. Okay. Thank you very much.
PhD candidate currently at Harvard, and will be speaking more about these wonderful mapping practices.
Which one? Hi everyone. So today I'll be presenting a section of my PhD dissertation on Qing Mongolian cartography, and this talk will address one main question. Why did Ovoos begin to take a prominent space on Mongolian local maps in the 1860s. So first, I will document and explain a shift in the cartographic representation and creation of Ovoos by comparing maps of the late 18th and early 19th century with mid-19th century maps. Second, I'll try to explain why this shift happened. And third, I will illustrate how the mapping and setting of Ovoos were carried out on the ground and focus on the type of negotiation, disputes, and conflicts that arose. So here's a set of larger questions that I'm addressing in the dissertation project. So basically the impact of the Qing imperial expansion on pastoralist populations living in sensitive frontier zones, change in the territorial administration in Khalq Mongolia in the 19th century. In other words, how was Mongolia connected to broader geopolitical events that redefined sovereignty and territory in the 19th century? And I'm also exploring the use of Ovoos and maps as instruments of empire in Khalq Mongolia. So this project is based on a year of archival research, mostly at the National Archives of Mongolia and for other institutions. Given the access of the documents, I focused my research on the two easternmost imac, well, mostly the Sitsenhan imac of Khalq. First, what kind of shift happened in the 1860s? This is just this is a kind of graph that shows the maps that are available. So here on this graph, you can see that in early 19th century, they began to be produced, and then there's an increasing number of them over time. But that might also speak just to like the idea of conservation of the maps, where the latest one tend to be better conserved. So here you have archival documents where local banner officials inventory the number of maps, and you can see that here in 1805 you have a peak in map making, 1864, 1890, and the early 19th century, so 1907 to 1910. So the next set of slides is going to illustrate the evolution of the mapping technique and aesthetics. So the 1805 maps, as Isabelle mentioned, had no Ovoos and simply listed the name of the neighboring Jasaks on each of the cardinal and intermediate cardinal direction. So this is an even clearer example of an 1805 map that really emphasizes topographic features like hills, but display no continuous boundary line or contour or even Ovoos. Ovoos appear on this 1840s map, but they're not yet systematically listed or numbered, or they don't yet follow the kind of cardinal 24 direction that we saw on Isabelle's map. And again, the topographic features take a very large space on this map. So now the shift happened. Here's a 1864 map. So yes, as you can see here, this map has a grid, a scale. You can see that the Ovoos are all marked with red labels along a straight line that delimitate the contour of the map. So here I just showed three, but this slide shows a kind of a complete, evolution. These are all maps of one single banner, the Huizenwang banner in Setsenhan. So you can clearly see that there's a rupture happening here in 1865, and the style remains pretty much constant to 1911, except for red labels that drop of the maps, but the grid, the scale, and the general look of the map remains consistent. Moreover, in 1864, the topographic features become subsumed within the boundary line. On this earlier 1845 map, you can see that the red line delineating the contour of the map was curved and irregular. It was interrupted or substituted by the flow of a river painted in blue. hills and peaks encroached and crossed over the boundary line, or were even painted completely outside of the map, like this mountain that you can see there. Ovoos were represented with double or triple red triangles and were not systematically named or numbered. So here I compiled a set of data on maps that I've seen at 6 different institutions to document this pattern and shift in the mapping aesthetic. And as you can see on this graph from 1864, there's not a single map was drawn with a topographical feature painted over or outside the boundary line. So we can conclude that both a quantitative and a qualitative shift in mapping took place in the 1860s, where an increasing number of them were produced with sharply different aesthetics and techniques. Okay. So to better grasp the kind of cartographic and territorial changes happening in the mid-19th century, it's worth looking at an earlier cartographic representation. This map is the earliest local Mongolian map available to researchers, as far as I know. I found it at the National Library of Mongolia, and it has never been published or studied. So I will use this map as a baseline to understand subsequent changes that happened to the cartographic and territorial organization. So this map is entirely Mongolian, was produced by a local Mongol. On this map, banners were localized and situated in relation to topographic features, but they were not represented as bounded communities. So yeah, just to clarify, this is a league map, and then the banners will correspond to the kind of like textual annotations here and there that list the name of the jasak, or the head of the banner, along with the number of men available in each of the banner. So specifically the name of 21 jasaks with the rank were indicated. And for example, you have the Jasak Sonom north of the Headland River on the center of the map that has 1 sum and 10 men. It's oriented. Okay. Here you can see what actual territory it corresponds to with a GIS projection of the map. And so you can see that it's oriented towards the northwest, or it actually follows the orientation of the Headland River that becomes the kind of dividing line of the maps as well. It's really, you can see that on the north of the Headland River, the text and mountains are represented like kind of following a top-down orientation, but here the texts are kind of bottom-up, so you have to like completely turn it around 180 degrees to have a face view of each of the topographical feature and text. Okay. So on later maps, information about population and census disappeared, and maps become represented as increasingly territorialized. So why and how, we're going to skip that. Why and how did new cartographic practices emerge in Khark Mongolia in 1864? So coming back to the 1864 maps, their defining feature comes from the fact that a system was developed to create correspondences between ovoos established in situ or underground and those represented on maps. This system involved the use of a grid, a scale, and also cardinal directions such as the 24 direction and the sexagenary system. In this process, ovoos became tools to imagine, create, and represent boundaries on maps and on the ground. So, combined with maps, they were technologies used by the Qing state to redefine the land, territory, and frontiers at a time of great geopolitical changes. On this slide, you have a letter mapping instruction that was sent from the Zhongliyamen, or the foreign office of the Qing, and transferred down to the banners. The Zhongliyamen, or Foreign Office, was created in 1861 in the aftermath of the Convention of Beijing that marked the end of the Second Opium War. This office was designed to centralize in Beijing the management of relations with Western states instead of relying on imperial commissioners in the treaty ports like Shanghai. Thus far, historians of China have thought that this office primarily dealt with relations with foreigners on the coast, but these documents here illustrate how the Qing frontiers started to be managed interconnectedly in the 1860s. So this document here makes an explicit connection between coastal frontier and terrestrial frontier, like Mongolia. The official wording also changed. So on this 1864 documents, the imperial resident in Hure, Amban, used terms like Delhi or Earth, World, Universe, and insisted on the importance of going and surveying places to produce geographical records. The Amban stressed the necessity of producing empirical geographical data relying on survey methods. The use of a new terminology referring to a form of universalism was linked to a particular geopolitical context where states developed and implemented systems of cartographic correspondences. These systems not only helped locate boundary markers with a higher degree of accuracy, but they also produced continuity across different regions of the empire. In the 1860s, the Qing officials were dealing with challenges to their sovereignty on multiple frontiers, and they had to coordinate with other states to produce maps, define boundaries that would then be written into treaties. They were also dealing with threats of Russian encroachment and became aware that geographical knowledge was of prime importance to prevent the loss of huge tracts of land, like what happened with the treaties of Aigun, Pekin, and Tarbagatay from 1858 to 1864 with Russia. And these issues had deep implications on the half Mongolian territory that became sites of experiment to create and represent interbanner boundaries, which were connected with larger issues of interstate frontiers. So on this slide, you can see the citation specifying the type of scale, grid, and color code that had to be used on maps and followed by local officials. Here you can see the cardinal direction that was used to create those correspondences between ovos and record them on chests or written records that came with the maps, and also record the distances between ovos. The maps were produced by the tuslach or assistant bannerheads and were then cross-compared by bannerheads who had to see if the banner maps of banner A, let's say, corresponded with the banner map of his neighbor, the banner B, and record if there were any discrepancies, get back to the local officials and request maps that corroborate each other. But how is this done? I'm running out of time, but a section of my paper tells a bit the social history of the Mongolian remaking of the territory in the 1860s by looking at the type of negotiations, disputes, and conflicts that we're here, that the maps elicited. This is an example in 1835 where the League heads of Setthan sent a letter to the military governor requesting an intervention from his office to set the boundaries between the banner of Setthan. And so even though maps had been previously drawn and reports were submitted, claimed the League heads, no Ovoo had been set at the intersection of the banner of Setthan, Gombojab, and Chirintashi. In 1864, the state sought to incorporate these undefined land that stood in between banners into one banner or the other through the establishment of ovos and their cartographic representation. When the banner heads and assistants were unable to set the ovos, or if there were no records as for the location of the ovos, mediators were dispatched by the League heads, and an agreement had to be reached through a long deliberation process. this had implication for land use at the local level, which I further develop in my paper. So let me conclude here by recapping the main points that are presented. In conclusion, the 1860s maps changed from heavily topographical to annotated cartographic representations that gave a prominent space to ovoos and boundaries. The topographical features became subsumed or incorporated within the political boundaries on the maps. And third, the boundaries went from curved or undefined contours to straight lines connecting ovoos. I'll stop here, and thank you very much, everyone.
So there's been many studies on the contemporary and historical role of Ovoo for the interaction between different ethnic groups, identity building and identity preservation, and the study of the processes of ritual offerings to and the methods of worshipping Ovoos across many Mongolian and Tibeto-Mongolian regions. So I'm not going to try and go into all of the different definitions and contexts that we find Ovoos in, given that there's so many compelling arguments for the variety of possible origins of Ovoo in the different studies carried out to date. Just going to proceed to look at the Buddhist context of Ovoo and look at some textual evidence for the Buddhist heritage of certain types of Ovoos that we can say came from Buddhist traditions. Okay, so as for the texts that I'm going to look at, there's the two texts by the third Mergengegen that was written in the 18th century. The first one is called The Custom of Erecting Ovoos, and the second text is The Custom of Venerating Ovoos. So Mergengegen mentions in the first text, which is The Custom of Erecting Ovoos, nowadays, people nowadays have erected a great variety of ovoos in different number sets and shapes, like the single ovoo, many different ovoos, and the 108. It is uncertain at present how exactly these ovoos were erected in these ways, and there's no perfect guidebook handy to explain the reason. It seems that intelligent people are able to do so skillfully due to their meritorious intention, but it's possible that the careless and clumsy people just imitate and casually follow their own will when erecting ovoos and making offerings in the way of the black shamans and shamanesses, and would say, we have erected ovoos and made offerings, but this is not beneficial to themselves or others. Therefore, I will explain the origin of the 13 types of ovoos. So here he's referring to a particular set of 13 that we find across Mongolian lands, in an accessible way, and introduce it thoroughly to my ability. In the original sutra, it was said that the emperor of the mountain was so magnificent that it was like Mount Meru. So this is in the introduction of his text on how to erect ovoos. So what we can summarize from this passage are the following 5 things. So during his time in the 18th century in Mongolia, there was a huge variety of different types of ovoos in regard to their form, shape, and numbered sets, like the 13 that he's going to explain. There was texts in circulation that concerned how ovoos should be erected. There was no clear explanation to the background of these differences, nor was there as readily available text that could act as the authority in clarifying the matter. The number of variety of ovoos suggests that the erection and veneration of ovoos was very popular, but people seemed to be erecting them without considering the proper way of doing so, which Mergen, and here I should say Mergengegen, considers as one of the possible reasons for their unexplained differences. And he also considered such unauthentic practices to be harmful. The shamans seem to have had their way of erecting and venerating ovoos, which wasn't necessarily rejected as a reality because it happened, but he considered it unbeneficial in the context of the Buddhist conventions of the practice, and he's going to explain it from the Buddhist perspective. So the 5th point is the one that I really went into for this paper, is this original sutra that he refers to, which seems to suggest that there did, or still does, exist a text concerning how to erect ovoos that Mergengegen was referring to as the authority that he thought was authentic. So in trying to look at what this original sutra may have been, I came across a Geshe from Inner Mongolia, or he's from Ordos, and in a conversation he told me that he has a text that is attributed to Guru Padmasambhava, And he says this text in the colophon says it's from the 8th century. It's a handwritten Tibetan language manuscript, and it is the custom of erecting oboes. So I was hoping to get hold of this text and present it at this conference, but unluckily I wasn't able to get hold of it. He said he would send it to me via WeChat, but he says he can't find it right now. Maybe there's an element of he doesn't want to share it right now, but I'm hoping when I see him next, this summer or the next, I can get hold of it and present it in detail. In any case, he did give me a short interview to tell me what's in the text, and so this is kind of paraphrasing what he said. So he says, the text goes through the steps of erecting a bow in much detail, as clearly as an architect describing the layout of their desired house to the builders building the home. In doing so, the exact dimensions of the foundations and other layers and what's in them are given, in the order of consecration of the religious sports in the various cardinal directions, the visualizations of the continents and the oceans of the cardinal directions, the objects to be placed in the oboe, such as precious stones, auspicious objects, types of wood to be used, accompanying munches that are required to be placed in the oboe, where to place them, and the deities that correspond to the oboe, the gates, and the other retinue oboes that accompany the main oboe, and the order of consecrating the different oboes, and so on. So this is the text I originally wanted to present, but in any case I wasn't quite able to do that. So last night I went home and thought, I don't want to just sit here and read out the text because it's not going to do much. And instead I will try to use the text that was composed by Remaking on how to erect an oboe, which does go through the stage-by-stage instructions of how to erect an oboe, how to lay the foundations, what the measurements are and what to place in them. And I thought I would draw some images according to those dimensions to kind of give a more visual idea of what they would have looked like according to the 18th century text by Remaking. Okay, so this is what I came up with. So he says, an oboe should be erected laying a circle with a radius of 8 cubits, with a 3.5 cubits thick in the center as the base. So that would be the base here. So it's 3.5 cubits tall, which is, every cubit is about 44 centimeters or to 52 centimeters. 8 cubits in terms of the radius, which is a circular, as the base layer, and then there'll be 3 extra layers on top, being reduced by half every time. So it would look something like this. The top 3 layers are all 2 cubits tall, but then they reduce in size as you go up, and in the center should be placed good wood, or good quality wood, and he says something like juniper, that has good berries, or fruit, that bears good fruit. And on the top layer, one should put flags with the Mani mantra, the 6-syllable Mani mantra on it. And then he goes on to describe what is to be laid inside and on top of the different layers. So I just thought before that, because this is just from the internet that I pulled up right now. I have a text by the Desi Sangegatsu from the 17th century on how to draw Buddha images and the different dimensions of stupas and so forth. And an artist recently did all the dimensions as kind of tankard grids, and it's not too different, but this one isn't, as authentic as the one contained in the book that came out from Brill a couple of years ago. But you can kind of see some similarity to the idea of a Buddha and a stupa, in that the bottom layer is the thickest, it's 3.5, and the rest are all symmetrical in terms of their height. With the Buddha image, from the waist down, generally from the belly button down, it's the section where he's sitting cross-legged, that's the thick, the taller part. And then this section, and the head without the urna is generally symmetrical. And then there's bits in between, depending on which deity or which Buddha or which style of stupa. So it's not exactly the same, but there's more similarities with this type of oboe that's described in Remakin's text to stupas or Buddha images than the other different types of piles of stones we get as oboes in other areas. Anyway, so he goes on to explain what's inside. So he describes the first layer, which will be the top layer first. So that layer is divided into three: the base, the middle, and then the top. So the base, one should build the walls with these precious stones if you can. If not, just to have a little bit of each would be fine. I accidentally swapped over the south and east. So south and west. So the dragon should be in the south and the magpie should be in the west. So there should be a white tiger in the east, magpie in the west, blue dragon in the south, and a black frog in the north with the corresponding precious stones that should be laid into the walls. So this is the bottom layer of the top of the four layer. Followed by the middle layer, we should have a Garuda, a white Garuda in the center, with a wish-fulfilling jewel on top, and the sun and the moon and the sun and the moon on either side, and there should be 21 birds circling Garuda. And there should also be weapons, mirrors, ribbons, and wish-granting jewels, and a Mani flag that should just be put in there, in the central layer. Followed by the top layer of the crown layer, right? So there's the four layers. There's a top layer which should be divided into these three layers when you're constructing it. And that should have these animals in the different directions, and each of the four corners should have the deer, monkey, bat, and white crane, which I wasn't sure if it meant 4 of each on each corner, or if it should be divided out. But he doesn't explain which one should go where, so I interpreted it as such. And as for the second top layer, it should have the 8 auspicious symbols and then the trigrams. This is kind of interesting because the only trigram in the Tibetan tradition that I could find that's depicted in tankas kind of goes again back to the text by the Sisenge Gyatso, the regent of the 5th Dalai Lama in the 17th century, which is supposed to come from the Chinese tradition of laying trigrams. So here, a Tibetan tanka depicting what the trigrams would look like, that has Garuda. Well, that's not Garuda, I'm not sure who that is. So, but you have the trigrams, and then you have the 12 animals of the year, which appears in the next layer that Marigungigan says you should, next layer of Ovoo described by Marigungigan. So this would be the third layer from the top, and it should have the 12 animals of the year. And then finally, the bottom layer, so this would be the big base, it should have amulets, birds, beasts, animals, and Toma offerings. So, again, coming in from the Buddhist angle, it kind of is reminiscent of how you would lay out different mandalas, whatever they may be referring to, in the Buddhist context. So that is the main Ovoo. So his set has 13 Ovoos, and the other 12 should be laid out in this way. So you have the center, which has the mantras of Buddha Sakyamuni, different lamas, protectors, and bodhisattvas. And then in the 4 cardinal directions, you have 4 accompanying retinue Ovoos, which will be accompanied by 2 smaller Ovoos. And he explains the main one should be the largest, following the dimensions that he gave with the 8 cubits, 3 cubits high, 2 cubits, 4 cubits, and so forth. And the retinue Ovoos should be smaller, but it should follow the same model. And the accompanying, the smallest ones that accompany the retinue Ovoos should also be smaller than the cardinal Ovoos. And they should also follow the same style. And then he describes what mantras of which deities should be placed inside these Ovoos. So you have the different deities laid out there. So this was my very rough drawing of what these kind of Ovoos, according to Marigungigan's model, would have looked like if they were actually built in that way. Because right now we don't really have any solid evidence that suggests people built Ovoos following this model. Apart from a reference that Sam gave me earlier, which I wasn't quite able to put into this because of the last minute thing, but I think maybe you can make a comment on that in a minute. Anyway, so the point that I was trying to make by looking at all of this was to make a connection between the cairns, oh gosh, it's 50 minutes, that are found in Tibet. So I was going to go through a Tibetan text that talks about building cairns and how to venerate them, but I'm not going to have time, so I'm just going to skip to my conclusion quickly. So there was a text that this Gishi that I spoke to mentioned, which is supposedly by Guru Padmasambhava, that talks about building cairns. In Merkingigen's text, throughout the two texts, he constantly refers to this old sutra that's attributed to Guru Padmasambhava. So we have a couple of references from there here. He says, although there's, as it is in the old sutra, it is said that Vajrapani, if we say briefly, in the second bit he says it was composed by Guru Padmasambhava, and so forth. And there's about 4 sections where he refers to this text and attributes to Guru Padmasambhava as the text that he's using as the authority for his manuals. So my kind of hypothesis right now is that this text that he's referring to is this Tibetan text. He constantly mentions that there are no Mongolian texts of our side that we can refer to as an authority, although texts exist. So he wrote his text in Mongolian for a Mongolian audience. He was, I guess, the lineage holder of the tradition that tried to preserve everything that is Buddhist in Mongolian lands in Mongolian. So he would have been writing this text for a Mongolian audience. So to make the Tibetan one more accessible to the Mongolians, I guess would have been his reason, because I guess people in his lineage would have been less familiar with the Tibetan. So I also wanted to quickly show you some images of oboes that I found in Alisha that follow this model. So Alisha is on the western border of the Gobi. That is the last Mongolian place before you go into eastern Tibet, essentially. And there you get lots of mixing of Tibetan and Mongolian cultural elements and language when it comes to the landscape and their cultural history and the local legends. So these pictures were taken by me next to, and these were the oboes at Olan Sobruk, which is this naturally formed rock formation, and it has a monastery connected to it that is considered to be a Nyingma or Red Hat monastery, and it's a branch monastery of, so this is Olan Sobruk Sum, and it's a branch monastery of Aguinsum, which claims to be the only Nyingma monastery in Inner Mongolia that has been so since the 8th century. There's no evidence to prove this is the case, but the oboes surrounding it, you can kind of see one in the distance. I can't remember how many there were exactly, because I didn't take these pictures with the intention of taking pictures of for this conference. I just took pictures when I was visiting, but they are all in this 4-layered formation. I don't know if you can see them very clearly. Can you kind of see? Like there's one here, one there, and one there. And the obo that I really wanted to get a picture of is this Lungin obo, which is apparently a obo that marks the gravesite or the tomb of Genghis Khan's general who was buried there. And it's on top of a mountain. And Lung is obviously the Tibetan word for wind. And they say if you say the name of the obo near the mountain or on top of or next to the obo too loudly, then the wind will come and attack you. But a lot of the locals don't understand Lung to be a Tibetan thing at all. They just know that there's wind, and it's called Lungin Ol and Lungin Obo, and it marks this. Okay, ooh, where is it? Okay. So this is the closest I managed to get to it. But from what I can tell, there seems to be like a base. So this is the obo on top of Lungin Ol. This is Lungin Obo. It seems to have these layers. It seems also a little bit ruined, and I hope in the future I can go and actually have a look at it to see, what kind of form it follows. But seeing that the other obos in this area follow the same model as Merkingigen's, I'm inclined to think it might also be similar in its structure. So in any case, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker is, not sure if this is on, Brian Bauman, who is lecturer in Mongolian Studies here at UC Berkeley.
Hi, how you doing? Nice to see you. Thanks to Cavalry. I'm sorry, I just came from teaching class. I can hardly move my mouth. Cavalry and everybody who worked with this conference. It's been really a pleasure, actually, and quite productive. So anyway, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, here goes. So such as it is. So the Mongolian Ovoo is an artless, unremarkable thing. As the Russian Mongolist Alexei Poznev once said, an Ovoo is nothing but a pile of rocks. Thank you. So this Ovoo is nothing but a pile of rocks accumulated helter-skelter on top of some mountain. Rock piles such as those found in Mongolia are ubiquitous throughout the world. I come from a farm in North Dakota, which, like other North Dakota farms, is simply littered with them. And yet, inordinate to its simplicity and disproportionate to its commonality, scholars have devoted a great deal of study to specifically Mongolian iterations of a rock pile. So my place of birth, Rugby, North Dakota, happens to be the geographical center of North America, and we the good people of Rugby signify this wonderful distinction with a great big pile of rocks. But though people on the highway do occasionally stop by the cairn for a picture and maybe buy a t-shirt, anthropologists aren't beating down our doors to find out why we have that rock pile there. So a negative side of our fascination is that scholarship often sinks to banality. So simply to gloss the meaning of Ovoo as rock pile will not do. The literature must always assiduously define the Ovoo as a pile of rocks. It tells us that Ovoo are found on mountains and really just about anywhere, and then lists every sort of place where they are found. It often comes with canned phrases telling us that Ovoo reflect the logic of the concrete, or vapid phrases such as, an Ovoo signifies the spirits of the land and water. So I told my mother the other day that I was giving a paper on a rock pile, and she said, "Oh, that's interesting, dear, but what will you be talking about?" I try for a joke. But the benefit of this peculiar interest is a wealth of good scholarship for which we know a great deal of fact about Mongolian Ovoo. We know the types of Ovoo that exist, where they are found, who venerates them, how they are venerated, when they are venerated, and why. We know how Ovoo veneration has evolved over time from its apogee in the Buddhist world of the Qing dynasty to its decline under communism and its renewal since 1992. And we can glean something, at least, about what Ovoo veneration was like prior to its Gelug promulgation. Yet driving academic fascination with the Ovoo is more than just a quest for fact. Something about this mundane subject troubles us. So we describe our bemusement as a quest for origins. The genesis of the Ovoo has yet to be determined, we say. So this quest for genesis is not confined to temporal beginnings. If it were, we would simply examine the evidence, reach a conclusion, and leave it at that. So this is the way things work, I guess. So deeper than this, our pursuit runs to the existential. We disagree or equivocate, say Evans and Humphrey, about the fundamental meaning of this form of monument. We understand the origin of the wheel. We might vouchsafe, as Karl Marx did, the existence of religion as the opiate of the masses. But troubling us to no end is the question, why on God's green earth would anyone in their right mind bother to worship an inert and lifeless pile of rocks? So sure, it is not the rock pile itself Mongols venerate, but the spirits that they stand for. But this, in a way, is even more perplexing. A pile of rocks, at least, is tangible and real, but spirits assuredly are not. And here the problem becomes downright vexing. All of our inquiry into human nature tells us that apart from ourselves, all people everywhere have always worshipped spirits, and that the worship of spirits at rock piles is, if not universal, then quite commonplace. So why should this be so? In response to this existential crisis, we speculate over an Ovoo's reason for being. But being an existential question, the answers that we proffer are constrained by the limits to reality as we know it. As it is, because these are the very limits that make the question intractable in the first place, our solutions invariably succeed only in making the matter moot. Already since the 19th century, the prevailing view has been that Ovoo worship represents a primitive stage of religion wherein people believe in the spirits of nature, in spirits of nature. So like the pine trees lining the winding road, we give this thesis a name, we call it shamanism. And in this name we have come to believe in this thesis so wholeheartedly, we assume its reality historical. We believe that whereas Xuanzang venerated Buddha, Genghis Khan practiced a religion he knew as shamanism. By positing shamanism as our answer, but positing shamanism as our answer leads to other questions. So one of them concerns how something as primitive and crass as worship of a rock pile could survive in this enlightened modern day. So from the 19th until well into the 20th century, the answer to this question was that Mongols practiced primitive, primordial religion because they themselves comprise an unevolved inferior race. So a professor of English literature who happened to visit an Ovoo ritual in Inner Mongolia in 1937 noted, to denounce Lamaism as wicked superstition is foolish. Being so deeply embedded in the people, it is most likely a necessary force for their lives. They are a race of people who will soon die out unless some new spirit enters into them. So after World War II, the Academy walked back its theory of racial valence, but the notion of an intellectual elite dies hard among intellectuals. Today, theories of race have been supplanted by theories of genes. Positing a distinction between ourselves and our subjects, scientists, as we like to be called, look to the Ovoo to understand the behaviors born of a quote-unquote religious mind. These are people who, quote, commit to supernatural agents which from a scientific viewpoint do not exist, unquote. So various hypotheses are being tested. One championed by subscribers to evolutionary psychological theory is the supernatural punishment hypothesis, which supposes that, quote, supernatural agents may function to inhabit self-interested behavior and contribute to evolution and persistence of human cooperation, unquote. So an apology for shamanism more orthodox among Mongolists is to draw from the philosophy of Karl Marx. As Evans and Humphrey note, scholars argue, quote, in Marxist terms, that the rationale for constructing cairns changed over millennia with the development of society, but previous symbolic meanings lingered in local interpretations, unquote. Solutions to the existential question are checked by the historical pursuit of what ought to be the same end. From an historical perspective, let alone the beginning of time, evidence for the existence of Ovoo does not predate the 17th century. When we find it, it is a Buddhist cult. From their confluence in the late 16th century, to look back up to two venerable streams of Gelug and Mongolian traditions, one finds cairn ritual attested in Tibetan Buddhism, but little evidence for anything similar in Mongolian. Although it does not preclude possibility, some scholars, not unreasonably, take the absence of evidence to suggest that Ovoo worship among the Mongols did not exist in any form prior to Mongol conversion to Buddhism. So putting the historical debate aside and juxtaposing the existential and historical approaches, one sees immediately that the two pursuits reflect the origin of the Ovoo in qualitatively different lights. In light of historical inquiry, the Ovoo is unique among ritual forms in Mongolian religion and evolves over time. In light of existential theory, however, the Ovoo is like unto every other form of Mongolian religion. It all manifests primitive belief in imaginary sources of imaginary forces of nature, and it never changes. So in the process of filling the void in our knowledge with moot arguments, answers to the existential question have approached historical reality. Scholars are steadfast knowing Ovoo veneration manifests belief in spirits. Yet Vivi Linskog, having lived with herders from 1996 to 2003, noticed that her subjects do not consider the existence of spirits a matter of belief at all. Likewise, scholars are certain Ovoo veneration manifests religion, which our lexicographers define as personal belief divorced from politics. Yet David Sneath and others have demonstrated that Ovoo veneration serves government as much as it does religion. Still, in an existential crisis, truth-seeking can only go so far. Should a solution to the Ovoo problem transgress perceived reality, then the crisis will end in capitulation. Interestingly, there is one line that no study of the Ovoo ever crosses, and that is the line that the Ovoo cult and the spirits it propitiates might have something to do with science. Scholarship stands firm on the position that spirits do not, in scientific terms, exist. The position, however, is at loggerheads with the reality in Mongolia. There, the spirits of Ovoo worship not only do exist, but exist under the purview of Buddhist science. Thus we arrive at the thorn in our side. Goading us to endless study over a simple pile of rocks appears to be a question over the fundamental meaning of science. Let's pause here to remember Socrates. In Plato's Phaedrus, he teaches us that in dealing with complex subjects, it is essential in the first place to know thyself. So scholars belong to a science that is unique in human history. We know this attitude. The ultimate purpose of science is to further understanding of nature. For this, the assumption of strict causal determinism is sine qua non. Valid knowledge is that which can be objectively demonstrated. The only truth is factual. Science and religion are two separate, unrelated things. We forget, however, that this attitude comes not as a reflection of reality, the here and now, but rather through faith in a mutable order in nature, the realization of which is immanent. This faith comes to the Academy by way of the Enlightenment in Europe. It might come with repudiation of Christian theology, but not as a rejection of Judeo-Christian faith, Islamic faith, in a mutable order. Rather, it comes as a result of taking faith beyond soteriological understanding to its logical limit. So this faith-based worldview is not only not a scientific reality, it is the antithesis of scientific reality. In the world there is science proper and modern science, two completely qualitatively different things. Though science proper begins in recognition of the void in nature, a one and undifferentiated state existent in the absence of spatial or temporal orientation. The sensible world in which we live has to be created. The English word for the agent by which it is created is God. But every language has a word for this agency. In Mongolian, one such word is Tingr, heaven. Heaven is essential to the genesis of a sensible world because it is by heaven that we create space and time and thereby bring order to the void. The agency of God is inherently supernatural. The things by which we create the sensible world, a point of reference, the horizon, four directions, and so on, do not exist in physical form but must be apprehended cognitively through sentience, sapience. A point, Euclid tells us, has no magnitude, a line no breadth. It goes without saying that each of these supernatural agencies of God is real. The reality, however, is self-evident, axiomatic, not factual. Factual truth exists only in space and time. The reality of space and time, however, is merely a conventional reality that has been created from out of the void in nature by people through the agency of God. Should one unfortunately choose to limit one's knowledge to factual truth, all of one's knowledge goes to the practice of one's religion. One must deny oneself the science that goes into the creation of the sensible world in the first place, and thereby circumscribe one's intellect under the intellect of others. Against the void, the created sensible world is a political world. In that which simply exists, many worlds have been created. Because no inherent absolute order to the world exists, a world science becomes its religion. So consider the center of something. For the world to exist at all, one must fix a center to it. This is an axiomatic truth, true for all and always. But in an apparently infinite nature, the center that is chosen is arbitrary, conventional. In that center are one's science and religion, inextricably linked. So one's religion is one's means of orientation in space and time, one's language, one's activities, one's diet, manner of dress, how one treats other people, and so on, one's discipline, the discipline to one's life. So in the politically created, sensible world, that which binds people as one is ritual. Ritual forms nature. In Mongolian, this is bagel. That which simply exists into an inhabitable realm by coloring it in a manner amenable to a certain way of life. It colors it in its manner, that is, apotropaically. In Mongolian, the phrase for performing a ritual is willed, to do work. Ritual is merely a bit of work. So think about how vast Mongolia is, think about how sparsely populated, and yet how unified the people. What unifies the people? Only ritual does that. Of all Mongolian rituals, too, think how central the Ovoo is to binding the Mongols as a people. So the void never goes away. If one abandoned them in a deep, dark forest, Hansel and Gretel would be in the same predicament today as they were yesterday. And because the void impinges upon the created world always, the order to the created world must constantly be shored up. And so too it is ritual that not only gives appearance to the world, but maintains it and renews it. Traveling through Mongolia with a Buryat guide in 1892, Poznev, upon finding an Ovoo at a mountain pass along the way. So traveling through Mongolia with a Buryat guide in 1892, Poznev, upon finding an Ovoo at a mountain pass along the way, notes that people offer stones, rags, sticks, or pieces of dung, but that his guide, quote, as a man of refined piety, unquote, offers a bundle of prayer flags for this and every subsequent Ovoo that they would come to. Although an Ovoo is a quite simple and apparently unremarkable thing, it possesses a certain inherent quality that makes it supernatural. Something supernatural appears to exist in its manner of creation. Somehow human beings can create a heap of something in such a way that upon beholding the thing, any human will know intuitively that that was man-made. For its supernatural form, an Ovoo assumes a supernatural reason for being. As signifier of something man-made, it exists not merely in and of itself, but as a symbol. Whereas the existence of a dog might be emblematic of nothing, the existence of an Ovoo cannot but symbolize something. If a person snaps a twig, the act, even if intentional, does not necessarily signify anything. But if someone happens to erect an Ovoo somewhere, even if done with no ulterior motive, the act ineluctably signifies something, even if only to express that someone has been there. And as a symbol, an Ovoo's composition is itself symbolic. To make an Ovoo requires 3 stones for a base. Thereafter, it will retain a singular form no matter how many stones are added. In adding stones uniformly, the Ovoo assumes a unique geometry in likeness to a cone. To determine the number of stones in an Ovoo, unlike the 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, you don't have to count them all. If you know the number of stones in the Ovoo's height and radius, with a nifty formula, you can calculate the total with fair accuracy. For this aggregate composition, an Ovoo symbolizes corporation in the abstract and exemplifies a microcosm. It embodies the Latin phrase e pluribus unum, and so might signify any aggregation, any group or corporate body, a family, clan, nation, the world. Being symbolic inherently, how do Mongols apply Ovoo as a symbol? Here, a note on the word itself is in order. The Halch term Ovoo derives sound and meaning from 2 separate but closely related words, Aba and Obaga, the latter being a morphological derivation of the former. Aba is a good Mongolian word. It means heap, pile, mass, barrow. As a nominal stem, it implies convex shape and forms the active root to words such as obugor, bulging, convex, heap or bump-like, oboy, to form a conical pile or bump, obugadai or owadai, this hat that lamas wear, and many more. So in the word oboga, obo is inflected with a denominal noun suffix, ga-ge, which denotes locality in place and time. Oboga means not merely a heap of something, but a cairn or landmark. Halch awa denotes both meanings. In keeping with its intrinsic composition, awa signify corporate entities, the individual, a local hero, a well-loved horse, a family or camp, clan, the members of a military unit, the banner and other administrative units of the Qing dynasty, a khanate, the empire, and the cosmos. Of these corporates signified, awa seem especially integral to clan identity. Awa embody not only the living clans themselves, but also the spirits of ancestors, ongud. Morphologically, yet another derivation of awa appears to be obug, or clan. Although terms for heaps and landmarks are not attested in early texts, the term awag, clan, is. And as awag appears to derive from Ovoo, through the magic of philology, one can infer that an Ovoo cult might have existed among the Mongols long before their conversion to the Gelugpa in the 16th century. For were it not for an Ovoo in the religion, the Mongols as we know them would not exist. So as landmarks signify the life-giving, order-shaping characteristics of the earth that are intrinsic to the place they stand. So we find them distributed throughout the land here and there. They are used for finding safe passage through the wilderness, locating essential materials such as water, minerals, wood, and stone, reifying social hierarchy from ruler to the elite to commoners, demarcating various natural, kindred, religious, and administrative boundaries such as those to a watershed, pasture land, Buddhist monastery, and banner. It's used for fixing the centers to these various realms and to the universe itself, fixing a center, and in orienting them in cosmic terms under heaven relative to the four directions. And we are invited to believe that in marking the locations of scenic vistas and anomalous features of the landscape, such as lone trees or unusual rock outcroppings, although also sometimes signify things that serve no earthly purpose whatsoever, but still maintain their own excuse for being. At each of these places where Ovoo stand abides the presence of a certain sort of God, a God reflecting the essential character of the place and its function in protecting people from harm and bringing order to the world. This God bears different names and attributes, but collectively these are known as Ejin. They include Gajurin Ejin, a genius of earth, Osni Ejin, genius of water, Olin Ejin, genius of the mountains, and Matni Ejin, genius of woods, and other terms. I'll skip. Well, there's one. So there's Savdig of Tibetan origin, and Los, snakes, serpents, or dragons, a term that comes into Mongolian from Middle Chinese by way of Uyghur, but ultimately refers to the Naga of Sanskrit Buddhist tradition. So as for the word Ejin, it means lord, master, ruler, governor, or sovereign. In reference to a place, it is often translated as above, genius. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, genius is defined as the essential character, spirit, or tutelary god of something, whether person, place, thing, or idea. This definition is problematic, however, in that it either has become or is becoming obsolete. Another definition of genius is, quote, innate intellectual or creative power of an exceptional or exalted type, such as is attributed to those people considered greatest in any area of art, science, I'm almost done.
Okay.
And so on. Although coined only in the 18th century, this definition has become normative. Genius so defined is determined mathematically as 0.25% of the population or someone with an IQ of 140 or above. So by this definition, Madonna is genius, but a rock pile is not. So this lands us at the crux of our existential crisis with the Ovoo. Does the genius of a place exist or not? So far as scholarship on the Mongolian Ovoo is concerned, the answer has always been a definitive no. It tells us that the genie loci venerated in Ovoo worship are merely something that the Mongols believe in. As Vreeland tells us, Ovoo are sites where Mongols believe that they can contact gods which live in the earth. Scholars hold that this belief in genius originated in primitive man. They boldly claim that it originated about 100,000 years ago, and theorized that belief in genie loci was retained over millennia despite Marxist development of society. And scholarship is now asserting that belief in genius is what separates the religious mind of Mongols from the scientific mind of modern people. On the other hand, until recently, Western intellectuals accepted that genius does exist. So as far as their own world is concerned, at least. So in 1697, Dryden, translating the Georgics of Virgil, writes, the culture suiting to the several kinds of seeds and plants, and what will thrive and rise, and what the genius of the soil denies. I'd give another, but here's one final example. In the 1913 novel, O Pioneers, Willa Cather writes this. In 11 long years, John Berkson had made but little impression upon the wild land he had come to tame. It was still a wild thing that had its ugly moods, and no one knew when they were likely to come, or why. Mischance hung over it. Its genius was unfriendly to man. So that's a good English sentence. So in the face of this quandary, what should science say about genie loci? Do they exist or don't they? And I'll just stop. I'll leave it at that. All right.
Devin here, who is an independent scholar, has a PhD from Harvard, and has also been at the University of Kansas. All very fine institutions for the areas that we're
It's been a wonderful event. I'm primarily an economic historian. I work on financial history and quantitative history, so when I got this invitation, I thought, this is lovely, but I don't work on Ovoo, and I'm not going to have any documents about this. Surprisingly, unsurprisingly, they were everywhere. when I looked through a couple thousand documents from the National Archive of Mongolia that I had from 2011 to 2012, and documents from some Siberian archives, Ovoo were everywhere. So just start out with a little anecdote before I get to that image. In 1910, a young Russian economist named Buryatia led a small Russian team to Mongolia in order to bolster Russian economic interests in the region. The team had been tasked with producing comprehensive reports on Mongolia's economy. So he's mostly concerned with the details of economic life, and he just gives a brief account of his crossing into Western Mongolia, writing, "At the same point of the border of Russia and Mongolia, as we've already discussed, was located a border post with the look of a little house, in which a moment of our arrival lived one old man with his wife." So it's really quaint on the Russian side. He asks for a passport and he notes it in his book. A few versts over from the Russian post in Mongolian territory is located a Chinese post. At our arrival, it's a little bit of an offensive passage, 3 dirty, shoeless, Dorbit people in rags, who appeared as soldiers, came out of their gear. We presented our Beijing passport, which was written in Chinese. The soldiers only held it in their hands, obviously unable to read it, and returned it back to us. So the description of the border, and specifically the entrance into Western Mongolia, presents an image of a casually enforced boundary, manned by seemingly lazy and incompetent border guards. Buryatia's description of a near open space was anathema to the organized border regime envisioned by the Qing state. And granted, when his mission crossed in 1911, the Qing Empire was experiencing economic and political upheaval and was in the midst of its own projects, which were mentioned earlier, to shore up the border and transform Mongolia into a productive, often agricultural space. Nevertheless, the actions of these border guards, just waving people through with only a cursory glance at their travel documents, would have horrified Qing officials. And again, the author may have exaggerated the laxity of these border guards for their dramatic flair or out of casual prejudice. Nevertheless, his description underscores the human element of the Russian-Qing border. At over 4,000 miles, it was not and could not have been fully protected. It passed through jagged peaks, open steppe, boreal forests. So in order to create this border, starting in the 17th century and running up through the end of the Qing dynasty in 1911-1912, we see these states establish a series of guard posts, known in Manchu as Karun or Harol, and the troops would be stationed at these posts. Between these posts, a special type of obo, generally known as border ovo, different terms for that, would help mark the border in the empty spaces between the manned posts. And I'll talk about, as landmarks in sparsely populated areas, they were both points of control and actually meeting places for informal trade and exchange. So in principle, the markers and the guards who patrolled them were foundations of a well-ordered world in which people were kept to their national and regional bounds. But when this orderly world failed, and it failed often, Qing officials investigated and punished what they would refer to as corrupt practices, which encompassed all unauthorized movement of people or goods across the border. So this paper just asks a simple question: what role did border ovo play, and how this border works in practice in the 19th century? Try to move a little quicker. Okay, so what's the border actually physically? First, the basic thing to emphasize is that it's a zone. So we can see here, this is Kyakhta, the border between the Qing and Russian empires. We have on one side the Russian city, and then the trade city, the Maimaicheng of the Chinese side, and in between there's this kind of no man's land. And I actually never noticed this until I looked at this today, but I wonder if those two little, do you see the two little posts? Are those border ovo? I don't know, maybe. I'd never paid attention to them before. So this border comes into being in the late 17th century. Before the demarcation of the border, though, there's evidence that border ovo are already used to mark Mongolian territorial boundaries. Talked a bit about that in other papers. So this is not simply colonial impositions from distant metropoles. They seem to have meaning to people on the ground. And as Russian and Qing governments worked to draw the border in the 17th and 18th centuries, they're both aware that they're drawing it through a space that already has complex and overlapping jurisdictions. Surveyors worked to identify where ovo already existed and other kinds of territorial markers. They're not clear on what they mean by that in the documents I find. In the spring of 1726, Russian surveyors produced the first detailed Russian maps of what would become the border. And the Siberian Governor General, in tasking this small team to go out and make the maps, said be particularly careful about where Ovoo and the Transbaikal are, because they could allow the Qing government to make claims on what they wanted to become Russian territory. And they were actually told just to go build Ovoo themselves. So probably they're just, I doubt there's any ritual to this. These are Russians from Irkutsk, they're probably just putting rocks, saying that's an Ovoo. The resulting line doesn't mark an exact border. We have, in theory, a Karen, an Ovoo, a Karen, an Ovoo, and they vary from how far they actually are from the line on the map. So the closest ones seem to be about 20 kilometers to the border, so this is pretty far. Others are several hundred li, so like maybe 150, 200 kilometers away. That seems too far to me, but so it says. They're not named originally, they're just given their locations relative to natural features like rivers or mountains. So when we think about this, think of it as a space through which movement is theoretically controlled, but it's not a line. In principle, these were supposed to be inspected every 3 years, every year to every 3 years, depending how strategic they were, by troops from Beijing. And they also should have had Qing officials come out from the imperial residence office or the other major offices in Ulyassta and Khovd to check them. Whether or not these always happened is another question. So the National Archive of Mongolia is filled with Qing reports about the state of border Ovoo, specifically whether there have been crossings or not. Often these reports say nothing at all, meaning we find no evidence. Again, not necessarily what's happening, but that's what they say. Other times, if there's a sign of a crossing, they will investigate, sometimes in concert with Russian officials across the border. So I want to talk about 3 types of encounter. We see it one particularly long case at an Ovoo near Kyakhta. So these cases appear in the archive. 5 minutes, okay. Okay, I'll be quick. I'll just give you an image of like a tourist postcard of a road going to Kyakhta. Imagine it from there. Yeah, these are kind of neat. Okay. So if we think about these schematically, the first is that they see herds of animals crossing the border. This is usually the least concerning kind of thing to find around a border Ovoo. They often find 4 or 5 tracks. This becomes a problem because they find 150 tracks. So that means someone's really seemingly pasturing a large group of animals where they should not be, versus the kind of daily crossings that are not too concerning. This herd of 150, though, opens up a can of worms at this Ovoo, and what they find is that 13 Chinese merchants have apparently been living and trading around this place. They've been exchanging tea for livestock, and the livestock belong to people at the guard post. So this livestock is essentially being sold to Chinese merchants on interest. The livestock is becoming payment on the constantly accruing debt that people working at the Khatern and patrolling the Ovoo have. And this is viewed to be benefiting Chinese merchants who are able to manipulate the interest rates to be much higher than the 3% that would have been allowed by law, because they can claim a cow is worth very little money and therefore they're not charging so much interest. So this was actually punished very severely. We have evidence that 20-some people are killed, 20-some people are tortured. So why are people doing this trade if the punishment's so severe? The short answer is because it's likely a necessity. Chinese merchants had been permitted to live in Mongolia in increasing numbers since the 18th century, in large part because grain is very expensive to transport. It's much better to grow it locally. In 1806, these licenses are reduced, and by 1854, when this case is happening, we have evidence that people are hurting because the lack of grain is driving up prices for all goods in the region. Trying to be quick. So the Chinese merchants are there. This is part of the problem in addition to the large herds. This investigation also finds Russian traders seemingly working around the Ovoo regularly. And one person in the deposition reports that this is a known route kind of to go south of Kyakhta and bypass the customs post. So it reports in this deposition, every day 28 soldiers join up and they successfully patrol the Karen-Ovoo border roads, but they leave a gap along the border roads, meaning, when they're not patrolling, there's no one there. And in this gap, Russian people come together, they flock towards these border places from both directions, and at the time they exchange lots of tea and cloth. So seemingly this Ovoo is actually becoming a meeting point for people on both sides of the border to come and exchange goods. So kind of the opposite of what we would think of its intended purpose. Briefly, it's not entirely clear always who these Russians are. A lot of the time they're local Buryats, who are themselves also stationed at the corresponding Russian posts. It's unclear if they're known as men of little capital or if they're actually relatively well-off traders. This depends in cases. Let's try to get to the conclusion. I can answer more questions about this if people have them. So we talk about contraband or the unlicensed movement of people, which in the case of this Ovoo are connected. It's always problematic because it relies on an absence of evidence, usually. So James Scott famously has told us it's the job of peasants to stay out of the archive. And this leads to a kind of David and Goliath, Marissa knows where I'm going with this, depiction of unlicensed trade. So the government writes laws that are somehow out of step with local reality, and it's the expected role of people on the ground to subvert them in order to get by. Numerous historians like George Diaz working on the US-Mexico border, sociologists, political scientists have demonstrated those who move goods in an unlicensed way, smuggle goods, create their own moral economies and codes of conduct. Simply what looks illegal to a central government can be well regulated on the ground. But the longer I've sat with these materials, too long, the less well the narrative given above about this kind of staying out of the archive has sat with me. And instead I want to ask what benefits accrue to a state that may choose, at least at times, to not see what's going on. So to conclude, and maybe pose a little bit of an answer to this, I want to take some feedback that I got from the workshop earlier and discuss a little bit about how border guards were paid. So the last 2 days, I could only find 2 documents about this, one from a published document and one from a budget that I had. In 1810, a soldier at this Karun would have gotten every month a bolt of fabric valued at 1 silver tael, 2 boxes of brick tea, which had the value of 2 copper cash, that's very little, and 1 pouch of yellow tobacco with a value of 1 copper cash. So he's being paid, first of all, he's being paid, so the Karun can't actually support all their needs with animals, and he's being paid in goods that are the most common commodity monies in circulation at the time. So the state is actually in some ways subsidizing the goods that go into this trade. In the 1905 budget, same thing. Oh, yeah. One official, when he comes back from inspecting this, he goes to the yamen, he gets a payment of 1 silver tael and 6 copper cash in exchange for having done his inspection. And then he's given 1,300 bricks of tea, 1,326 bricks of tea, 15 yellow pouches of tea, and 20 silver taels for distribution to people back at the border. How many people did it go to? I could calculate it, but I didn't. More important than the numbers is that they're being paid in commodity money that is accepted on both sides of the border, in addition to actually money. So this is not a self-contained economic system. There is some knowledge by the government that people are needing to trade in order to sustain themselves. So rather than seeing unlicensed trade at Ovoo and Karun as dysfunction, we could turn this around and see this as precisely what allowed the border zone and its network of Ovoo, Karun, and guards to work in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you. So, for the past 3 days, I've learned so much about the construction of Ovoo. Isabel, I'm over here. You know, from our colleagues and scholars, I've learned so much about the construction of Ovoo, different types, and where they, resembles and what was their duty. But are there any scholarships on deconstructing an Ovoo? Like, was there any reason to deconstruct, or was there ever an Ovoo that was constructed and then deconstructed?
I've seen them vanish.
Yeah.
Considering the climate of Mongolia, they can collapse easily by themselves.
But not for like a person or like local government say, okay, let's deconstruct this Ovoo.
About boundary Ovoos, there are many cases of destruction and reconstruction of Ovoos to move the border when people are not agree, or they disagree with the location of the border. They destroy the Ovoo and they build another one on the place they think their border is. So there are many. I refer to one conflict like that in Ordos that lasted a century in my article of the conflict between two banners of Ovos, where they never stop destroying and rebuilding the Ovo. Another place. Opinion on the construction of Ovo?
Yeah, they would take them down and move them all the time, and fight over them, and I've never seen it, but something about clan Ovos. There's a question about, did Ovo veneration exist prior to the Gelugpa and Buddhism? And one of the evidences that shows that there was clan veneration, or veneration of Ovo by clan, is the fact that certain clans would have to go down to China to venerate their clan Ovo, because back in the day, that's where their clan was. When they were thrown out of China in 1368, they had to leave their clan Ovo behind in China. So sometimes people would go down, rather than do that, they would dismantle the Ovo and cart it, which is not easy. It's just a big bunch of heavy rocks. Cart it back up to some place more preferable in Mongolia. So they would do that.
Thank you. I have one small question for Isabel, which has to do with that visual representation of some of the map of the boundary markers as being two rectangles. I was just curious about where would that representation come from, and why two rectangles? Is that more of a Chinese, Qing convention for cartography, or? So that's one small. Another question. Should I put it up now, or? Another question would be for maybe Brian, but maybe some other witnesses would have something to say about it, has to do with the big question that Brian put out about the genius loci. I was just curious, not knowing anything about the Mongolian context, if there is currently, especially in the context of cultural heritage discourses and so on and so forth, anything that is currently being discussed around the new, the non-human entities having new legal, legal status. So is that a kind of global discourse that has some kind of influence in Mongolia as well around the Ovos, and therefore would that at least partly answer some of your questions?
Very quickly. The depiction of border and boundary Ovos as two rectangles is proper to the western part of North Mongolia. Okay, Dazak, Hanaimak, and Hot Aimak, only on this territory. And it's not clear, but we know that this boundary or border Ovos had a big vertical sign, or like a kind of stele, just upon the Ovo, or just in front of the Ovo. And maybe an explanation could be what we've just seen, if I may, Devon? Yeah. Devon just has showed this depiction of boundary over which may be, I don't know, maybe an explanation. I don't have another explanation. Don't you have any photo of boundary, of border Ovo and watch for border Ovo?
I have some from the Russian side.
I did. Thank you for what you said. That does help.
Oh, the question was for you actually about the gender.
The
legal.
Yeah.
They have the legal, legal statute.
Do they have legal statutes? I don't know that.
Yeah, because you're thinking about in India, the Ganga River, etc. have legal statutes.
Yeah, or like New Zealand and the U.S. But I think that I would say no, and I mean I would say that because to say that the Orkhon River or something is a human person and that everyone is subject also to human laws seems really weird. I mean I don't think they would do that. Yeah.
Actually, in the Qing period, they had legal statutes because
granting titles.
Yeah, especially the four mountains, the most sacred mountains of half Mongolia. They received subsidies. They had the title, official title of duke, for instance, or print, etc. They were paid, they had horse fares, and they were fined if, for instance, they sent snowstorms, etc. To punish them, they were fined.
Yeah, their horses would be
Yeah,
taken.
yeah.
Yeah.
And they were slashed.
Yeah. Lashings and shackles but there are laws about, there's like a mining law about you're not allowed to, you're not supposed to build mines in watersheds and things, but that's still, I think, treating those as landmarks. And then there's also special strategic deposits. But it's separate from that. I think this trend of like, these are persons that have human rights and things. Yeah, but very interesting.
Investors that are.
Oh, okay.
And I think there's something about
Right.
legal status of mountains.
Great budget money and nothing bigger.
Yeah, but contemporary. To be checked. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, great question.
Hi, sorry. I actually have data on that in terms of heritage and heritage legislation. The problem with international heritage legislation is that it typically breaks down heritage into three categories: tangible, intangible, and natural. So in Mongolia, for example, with UNESCO, there are protections for the Borhong Hasdong, which of course is a place that hosts many spirits, has many Ovoo, but it's a world-recognized place of natural heritage, and so it is treated in the Western European natural heritage style, which is, of course, divorcing of social elements rather than incorporating. And then you have, rather than a wall themselves, or as pieces of architectural heritage perhaps, you have spiritual practice of the Ovoo, which I believe was only recently incorporated into this politics. But that doesn't include the landscape, right? And I think that partially the fact that heritage politics is a national, transnationalizing politic means that you can't give an individual identity protection for a spirit or for a mountain unless you're making it a naturally protected zone. And then when you make the naturally protected zone, it has to enter into a kind of secularized politic. Right, and that's a big problem in my research. So that's why. Sorry to interject.
So I think we can take one or a few more questions if we bundle them. Then we should take our coffee break.
Thank you for all the presentations. Very quick question. What can we figure out about the statuses of the people who were painting the maps that we were looking at? I mean, did they have other, I'm looking at it as an artist, or does the style of depiction match anything else? Do they also, say, inscribe Buddhist sutras and things like that? Is there a way to figure out?
I have no more information about that.
From what I could see in the documents, the people who drew the maps had no specialized training in cartography. They were usually the assistants of the banner heads, and I imagine that some might have been invested in painting for temples, but I haven't. Well, this doesn't emerge from the documents. But by looking closely at the maps, we can see some parallel between the Buddhist painting aesthetics and the maps. Yes.
Hello, thank you everyone. Gentlemen, you mentioned this Osnia again. So this is in reference to, were any Ovoos actually constructed according to the plans given by Ecological? Is there any evidence anywhere historically? And after the workshop of the day, I remembered there is something that sounds like it could be from Bosnia, and it's when he's walking with his guides through outer Mongolia in the 1890s, and they come across the Ovoo of Qinghai, remarkable for its large size, and it was, they say, built by the order of the 4th Buryatia, who was active from 1775 to 1813. That's the fourth Gypsum. And the veracity of this legend is vouched for to a certain degree by the form of the structure, in which all of the rites of Tongkapa have been observed in building the Ovoo. It is erected on an elevated hill of earth densely overgrown with low grass. The stones are piled so that they form a round, table-shaped heap wide enough that a mound can still be placed right in the middle. This mound having a diameter of nearly 2 arshins, and then 9 more smaller mounds around it, these having a diameter of approximately 1 arshin. Like the Ovoo itself, the mounds on it are made out of porphyry rocks found locally. On the eastern side of the Ovoo, there is a square quadrangle, so a wall of some sort, also faced in stone. And on the 3 remaining cardinal points, there are small round Ovoos. So totaling 12 peripheral Ovoos, around 1 large 3-layer Ovoo, and associated with the 4th Gypsum, or who also was being active. He was known famously as a student of Palachakra and for bringing related texts from Tibet. I don't know if that can play into.
It was 1775, right?
Yeah, he was. So he was the 4th from 1775 to 1813. Just a comment.
I'm trying to come to some kind of conclusion, having seen a variety of Ovoos, north, west, south, and east in Mongolia. And in my recollection from the expertise that was brought to me at that time, they had diverse functions, of which people have been discussing, sometimes boundaries, sometimes markers, sometimes signification of a religious act, lots of shamanist bones, as was described, materials from shamanism. So is that a conclusion that they do have diverse functions, some of them operating almost like cairns direction, because so much of Mongolia is off-road, or at least it was when I was there. Is that accurate? That they can serve all of these different purposes and looking at different ones?
Okay. Yeah, okay, let's have a good break. Yeah. Okay. We'll be back at 4 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.